seen this model with 4 different So we have seen 4 different ways of explaining one phenomenon. So 4 different ways of trying to see how come participants in the rubber study managed to work out what emissions were correct and what emissions were not in this hypothetical grammar or artificial grammar. And this links with other classical theories that I think would be helpful in order to link the knowledge that these new theories are trying to provide. The first one is the behaviorist one, the second one is the generativist or nativist one, and finally the constructivist one. So the generativist one is actually this one, producing rule-based knowledge. So the idea that we are able to work out what emissions are correct by the rules that were hidden in the system. The behaviorist one is much better with the exemplar based learning, although it's not exactly the same concept. So let's see in more detail what is the behaviorist theory predicting. The idea is that children learn by imitation and reinforcement. So grammar is gradually constructed by receiving reinforcement after having used current sentences. So basically the idea that Burrus Skinner was presenting was that when we reinforce children emission, or when we produce an emission and we reinforce the result with a smile, for instance, we are basically creating the knowledge, the linguistic knowledge in this case. The problem with this theory is that it's difficult to explain creativity and also that it has very little empirical support. It is true that socially deprived and isolated children do not acquire language, and there are some examples of these. And also that the first words tend to be based on concrete things that are around the child. And actually we reinforce children's certainties. We are always searching for children's certainties that are successful, and we reinforce them with smiles, etc. But again, as I was saying, it's difficult to explain how much you can achieve by just such a simple type of study. So in essence, behaviorist theory is clearly nurture focused, so there are very little innate prerequisites, but it's very passive because children are not actively trying to find language, and also is continuous. Noam Chomsky developed his theory pretty much as a response to the powerful behaviorist model, because he thought that it was not possible to explain how much you can get with the behaviorist model. Basically, the idea is that actually children do not learn, that language grows in them in a similar way that our teething is changed at some point in our development. So it's a very powerful concept. We're going to watch him saying it because it's so powerful that I prefer to put it in his own words.
Well, I would want to even go beyond that. I think it's certainly the case that language is, in only the most marginal sense, is taught, and the teaching is in no sense essential to the acquisition of language. But in a certain sense, I think we might even go on to say that language isn't even learned, at least if by learning we mean any process that has those characteristics that are generally associated with learning. For example, the characteristics that I mentioned. It seems to me if we want a reasonable metaphor, we should talk about growth. Language seems to me to grow in the mind rather in the way that familiar physical systems of the body grow. We begin our interchange with the world with our mind in a certain genetically determined state, and through an interaction with experience, with an environment, this state changes until it reaches a mature state, which we call a state of knowledge of language. This sequence of changes from the genetically determined initial state to the final state in which we really have a quite complex system of mental computations. This series of changes seems to me very much analogous to growth of organs, and in fact, I think it's not inappropriate to regard the mind as a system of mental organs, the language faculty being one, each of a structure determined by our biological endowment, with interactions also generally determined by the nature of our biological endowment, growing through the triggering effect of experience, which shapes and articulates the organs as they develop in the individual through the relevant period of his life. So, as I say, it seems to me that not only is it wrong to think of language as being taught, but it's at least very misleading to think of it as being learned if we carry with the notion learning the associations that generally go along with it.
In other words, we are pre-programmed to learn a language in the same way as we're pre-programmed to grow arms and legs and reach puberty in our early teens and all sorts of other, sometimes delayed processes of growth.
Yes, and reaching puberty is a good example, since that's a case of biological development, of ontogenetic development. That's
how Chomsky gets to propose this very radical view on the acquisition of language. There are two ideas that he was considering. One of them was the fact that children do not receive negative feedback, so we don't correct them. And the second one is that this feedback is actually inconsistent. So there's a very rich input. Children are receiving not systematic sentences. So with these two ideas, Chomsky thought that it was not possible to acquire such an abstract and complex system in just 2 years of life. Stephen Pinker formulated one model called the semantic bootstrapping hypothesis. And what Pinker was supposing was that there was a series of innate principles that were leading us to syntax. They were semantic because the idea was that there were some universal ways of understanding the world. For instance, in a casual way. So we are always trying to find the cause and effect principles in all the sentences that we are processing. So whenever we have a sentence, we try to see what's causing what. This is just one example of one of the many semantic principles that Pinker was predicting to take place. We're going to see this with one example in the second hour of the lecture. But in essence, Chomsky formulated this thing called the language acquisition device, and it was this hypothetical innate structure that children had at birth and would lead them to while they were acquiring the grammar. So there was a high level of specificity for the grammatic knowledge. Basically, children had these predetermined constraints leading them into grammar. So when all they had to do is to be exposed to one language, and they would be fixing parameters for the language that they are exposed to. So this is actually the fourth theory that we've seen. So we've seen the behaviorist one before, and then Chomsky prepared these other nativist theory, which obviously is nature-focused And the role that children were playing is very passive, basically, because all they had to do is just to be exposed to the language. And this continues because there are periods in time when they would have set some parameters, and then they become competent in the language. And finally, we're going to be seeing a final position. Actually, this is a set of different theories, and all of them have something in common, and it's the fact that they are not assuming a specificity for the innate knowledge of grammar. So within this category, I am including models based on information processing. Basically, the idea is that children can understand the world in a general way, and then they build the cultural knowledge of the language that they are exposed to. One of the ideas that the neo-constructivist position has defended is that children have joint attention mechanisms. This is mainly formulated by one author called Tomasello. So it is very similar to what Vygotsky was defending about 100 years ago, saying that there is the adults and children share their knowledge about very specific things, and we are actually predetermined to attend to the same objects. Another principle is statistical learning. So that would be one of the lower, so one of the models that I was presenting at the bottom of the artificial grammars figure, saying that we human beings are very sensitive to the distribution, to the frequency of different items in the language. The neo-constructivist position is the last one that I am going to present during this first hour of the session. So I've covered a polarized set of theories. So I've presented theories defending a more nativist approach and theories defending a less nativist approach. I've used implicit learning because I think that it could be helpful to understand these models. And during the second session, we're going to be seeing more experimental methods and an introduction to developmental language disorder and the acquisition of